I stood in the dimly lit chapel, my hands trembling beneath the simple white dress that hung loosely on my too thin frame. The fabric felt wrong against my skin, a costume for a role I never auditioned for, a future I never chose. 20 years old, and I had never known a gentle touch, never experienced the warmth of family beyond the cold walls of St. Catherine's orphanage, where I had spent every day since I was left on their doorstep as an infant. Sister Margaret had raised me with firm discipline and little affection, preparing me for a life of service and humility. But nothing could have prepared me for this moment. The man standing at the altar with his back to me was not the husband of my dreams, not the partner I imagined during those long nights when I allowed myself the dangerous luxury of hope. He was Dante Ashford, a name whispered with fear throughout the city, a man whose empire was built on shadows and blood, whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud that blocked out the sun. I had heard the stories in hushed tones at the orphanage, tales of his ruthlessness, his cold heart, his complete absence of mercy. The sisters never spoke his name aloud, but I had pieced together the truth from fragments of conversations I was never meant to hear. Dante Ashford controlled everything that happened in the underbelly of our city, and somehow, through circumstances I still did not fully understand, I had become a bargaining chip in a game I never knew existed. Father Benedict stood between us, his weathered face showing a mixture of pity and resignation as he opened his worn Bible. The church was empty except for two of Dante's men who stood near the doors like sentinels, their presence a reminder that this was not a celebration, but a transaction. My legs felt weak as I walked down the short aisle, each step echoing in the cavernous space, each breath harder to take than the last. I had no family to give me away, no friends to bear witness, no one to object when Father Benedict asked if anyone knew why we should not be joined in matrimony. The silence that followed that question felt suffocating, heavy with all the reasons this should not happen, yet none that would be spoken aloud. When I finally reached the altar, Dante turned to face me, and I saw his eyes for the first time. They were the color of smoke and storm clouds, gray and impenetrable, set in a face that was devastatingly handsome in a harsh, angular way. His jaw was strong and defined, shadowed with stubble that gave him a dangerous edge. His dark hair was styled back from his face, revealing a small scar above his left eyebrow that only added to his intimidating appearance. He was tall, at least 6 feet 3 inches, with broad shoulders that filled out his black suit perfectly, and there was a coiled energy about him like a predator moments before it strikes. His gaze swept over me with cold assessment, taking in my simple dress, my nervous hands, my undoubtedly pale face, and I saw something flicker in his expression, gone too quickly for me to name. He did not smile, did not offer any gesture of comfort or reassurance. He simply stared at me as though memorizing my features for some purpose I could not fathom. Father Benedict began the ceremony, his voice steady, but lacking the warmth that should accompany such an occasion. The words washed over me like cold water, each phrase sealing my fate more completely. I tried to focus on the stained glass windows above us, the image of St. Catherine holding her wheel, the patron saint of my childhood prison, but my eyes kept being drawn back to Dante's face, searching for some hint of humanity beneath that granite exterior. When it came time for our vows, his voice was deep and firm. No hesitation, no emotion, just words spoken with the efficiency of a man completing a business deal. My own voice shook when I repeated the promises that would bind me to this stranger, this dangerous man who held my future in his calloused hands. I had been told by Sister Margaret the morning before that I had no choice in this matter, that the orphanage had debts, that arrangements had been made, that I should be grateful someone wanted me at all. The ring he slipped on my finger was heavy, a band of white gold with a single diamond that caught the light and sent rainbow fractals dancing across the stone floor. It was beautiful and cold, much like the man who had placed it there. When Father Benedict pronounced us husband and wife, there was no kiss, no tender moment of connection. Dante simply turned and walked toward the doors, and I understood I was expected to follow. His men fell into step behind us as we exited the church into the fading afternoon light. A black car waited at the curb, its windows tinted so dark I could not see inside. and one of Dante's men opened the back door with practiced efficiency. I hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the church that represented the only life I had ever known, as limited and lonely as it had been, and then I stepped into the car, into my new existence, into the unknown. Dante sat beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine with notes of cedar and smoke. He did not touch me, did not speak, simply stared out the window as the city passed by in a blur of buildings and people who had no idea that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. I wanted to ask him questions, to understand what he expected from me, to know what my life would look like from this moment forward, but the words stuck in my throat, trapped by fear and uncertainty. The drive took us through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent, houses giving way to estates until we finally turned through massive iron gates that opened automatically at our approach. The driveway wound through manicured grounds with towering oak trees that created a canopy overhead, their branches reaching toward each other like the arched ceiling of a natural cathedral. The house that came into view was more mansion than home. 3 stories of stone and glass that spoke of wealth beyond anything I had ever imagined. It was beautiful in a stark, imposing way, much like the man who owned it. The car stopped at the front entrance, and before I could move, Dante was out and walking toward the massive wooden doors, leaving me to follow once again. Inside the house was even more impressive, with marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, sweeping staircases that curved upward to the upper floors, and art on the walls that I suspected was worth more than everything I had ever owned in my entire life combined. A woman appeared from a side hallway, older, perhaps in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She introduced herself as Mrs. Reeves, the housekeeper, and her voice held a warmth that Dante's had lacked. She showed me to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, a space larger than the entire dormitory I had shared with 5 other girls at the orphanage. The bed was enormous, covered in soft white linens that looked like clouds, and there was a sitting area with a fireplace, a bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in, and a walk-in closet that was completely empty except for a few items of clothing that Mrs. Reeves explained had been purchased for me. She told me that dinner would be served at 7, that I should make myself comfortable, that I should ring the bell on the nightstand if I needed anything at all. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her, and I was alone in this beautiful cage. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap, and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning I had woken in the narrow cot I had slept in for 20 years, surrounded by familiar gray walls and the sound of morning prayers echoing through the halls. Now I was in a palace, married to a man I did not know, facing a future I could not predict. The tears came suddenly, unexpectedly, streaming down my face in hot trails as the reality of my situation crashed over me like a wave. I was utterly alone, more alone than I had ever been, and the irony was not lost on me that being married had somehow made me feel more isolated than I had felt as an orphan. I cried until I had no tears left, until my body felt empty and hollow, and then I washed my face in the pristine bathroom and tried to compose myself. I changed into one of the simple dresses hanging in the closet, a soft blue cotton that fit reasonably well, and sat in the chair by the window, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, painting the grounds in shades of gold and amber. At exactly 7, there was a soft knock on my door, and Mrs. Reeves appeared to escort me to the dining room. The table was long enough to seat 20 people easily, but only 2 places were set, one at the head and one to its right. Dante was already seated, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with tattoos I had not noticed before. He did not look up when I entered, did not acknowledge my presence until I had taken my seat. The meal was served by silent staff who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, placing plate after plate of food in front of us, dishes I could not name, preparations I had never seen. Everything tasted like ash in my mouth despite the fact that it was clearly expertly prepared. Dante ate with mechanical precision, cutting his food into exact pieces, chewing a specific number of times, all while maintaining that same unreadable expression. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, I found my voice, small and uncertain, in the vast room. I asked him why he had married me, what he wanted from me, what I was supposed to do in this place. He set down his fork and knife with careful deliberation, took a sip of his wine, and then turned those storm cloud eyes on me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back in my chair. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and cold. He told me that I was here because of a debt, that the orphanage where I had been raised had borrowed money from his organization, that they had been unable to repay, that I was the settlement of that account. He said that I would live here, that I would be provided for, that I would be safe as long as I followed certain rules. I was not to leave the grounds without permission. I was not to speak to anyone about his business. I was not to ask questions about where he went or what he did. I was to present myself appropriately when he had guests, to play the role of dutiful wife, to maintain the image he required. In return, I would have everything I needed, more than I had ever had before. A comfortable life that many would envy. He did not mention love, did not speak of partnership or companionship, did not suggest that this arrangement would ever be anything more than what it was in that moment. A business transaction dressed up in wedding vows. Have you ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond your control, bound by obligations you never chose, wondering if you will ever truly be free? If this story resonates with you, if you have ever felt like a pawn in someone else's game, please take a moment to type in the comments. I understand how it feels to have your choices taken away, so that others who are struggling with similar feelings know they are not alone, that their experiences are valid, that there is a community of people who see them and hear them and understand the weight they carry. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The days that followed blurred together in a strange routine that felt both surreal and suffocating. I woke each morning in that enormous bed, ate breakfast alone in a sunny morning room that overlooked gardens I was technically allowed to walk through, but somehow never felt comfortable exploring, spent my afternoons reading books from the extensive library or sitting by the window watching the world continue without me. Dante was rarely present, leaving early and returning late, sometimes not returning at all. When he was home, he was distant, polite in a formal way that maintained clear boundaries between us. Mrs. Reeves was kind, bringing me tea in the afternoons, suggesting activities I might enjoy, trying in her gentle way to make me feel less like a prisoner and more like a resident. But the truth was unavoidable. I was not free. I was owned, purchased, a possession like the art on the walls or the expensive furniture that filled the rooms. 3 weeks into this strange new existence, everything changed. It was late evening, and I had already retired to my room, changed into the nightgown that had been provided when I heard shouting from downstairs, the sound of raised voices and heavy footsteps. I opened my door a crack and peered out, my heart racing with fear and curiosity in equal measure. I could see Dante in the entrance hall below, blood on his white shirt, his face twisted in pain and rage. 3 of his men surrounded him, speaking urgently, and I caught fragments of their conversation, words like ambush and betrayal and hospital. Mrs. Reeves appeared, her face pale with worry, and began issuing orders to the staff with the efficiency of someone who had handled such situations before. I should have stayed in my room, should have closed the door and pretended I had seen nothing, but something in me, some instinct I did not know I possessed, propelled me forward. I hurried down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the marble, and pushed through the circle of men to reach Dante. Up close I could see the wound, a gash across his ribs that bled through his shirt, deep and dangerous. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw surprise, pain, and something else I could not name. I told his men to help him to the sitting room, my voice stronger than I expected, and I directed Mrs. Reeves to bring medical supplies, hot water, clean towels. Everyone stared at me for a heartbeat, this quiet girl who had been invisible for weeks, suddenly taking charge, and then they moved, following my instructions with the same efficiency they showed when following Dante's orders. I had learned basic first aid from Sister Margaret, who believed all the girls should know how to tend wounds and illness, and while I had never dealt with anything this serious, my hands seemed to know what to do. I cleaned the wound carefully, ignoring Dante's sharp intakes of breath, his clenched jaw, the way his muscles tensed beneath my touch. The cut was deep, but had missed anything vital, and while it would need stitches, he would survive. I worked with steady hands, threading the needle Mrs. Reeves provided, making small, neat stitches that pulled the torn flesh together. Dante watched me the entire time, his gaze intense and searching, and I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing. When I finished, I bandaged the wound securely and stepped back, suddenly aware that I was in my nightgown, that my hair was loose around my shoulders, that every man in the room had witnessed me touch Dante with an intimacy that went beyond our paper marriage. Dante dismissed everyone with a wave of his hand, and suddenly we were alone in the sitting room, the fire crackling in the hearth, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. He stood slowly, testing his movement, and then he did something unexpected. He reached out and touched my face, his fingers rough and warm against my cheek, and his voice when he spoke was softer than I had ever heard it. He asked me why I had helped him, why I had not stayed hidden in my room where it was safe, why I had risked exposing myself to his world of violence and danger. I told him the truth, that I did not know, that I had simply acted without thinking, that seeing him hurt had triggered something in me that overrode my fear. He studied me for a long moment, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture that felt almost tender. And then he said something that changed everything between us. He told me that everyone he had ever known had either feared him or wanted something from him, that people showed him loyalty because of what he could do for them or what he could do to them, but that I had helped him without agenda, without expectation, simply because he was hurt and I was there. He said that he had married me expecting nothing, that he had thought I would be like the other people in his life, playing a role, maintaining an image, but that in that moment when I pushed through his men to reach him, he had seen something real, something genuine, something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. His hand dropped from my face, but his eyes remained locked on mine, and I saw walls beginning to crack, barriers starting to come down, the first glimpse of the person hidden beneath the cold exterior. Over the following weeks, things shifted between us in subtle but significant ways. Dante began eating more meals at home, spending evenings in the library where I often read, asking me questions about my life at the orphanage, my dreams, my thoughts on books and music and art. He listened when I spoke, really listened, as though my words mattered, as though my opinions had value. He told me about his childhood, fragments at first, carefully curated pieces of information that revealed little, but gradually the stories became more detailed, more personal. He had grown up in violence, raised by a father who valued strength above all else, taught that emotion was weakness and compassion was a liability. His mother had died when he was young, and he had no siblings, no family who cared about anything beyond power and control. He had inherited his empire at 25 when his father was killed by a rival organization, and he had spent the last 8 years building it into something more powerful, more far-reaching, more untouchable. But in telling me these things, I heard the loneliness beneath the words, the isolation that came from living a life where everyone was either an asset or a threat, where genuine connection was not just rare, but dangerous. I began to see him differently, not as the cruel cartel boss of reputation, but as a man who had been shaped by circumstances as surely as I had been, who had built walls to survive, who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. He started coming to my room at night, at first just to talk, sitting in the chair by the fireplace while I sat on the bed, the conversation flowing easily in the darkness. He asked about my fears, my hopes, what I wanted from life, and I found myself sharing things I had never told anyone, secrets kept close during all those years at the orphanage. I admitted that I had always felt invisible, unwanted, that I had spent my childhood wondering what was wrong with me, that no one had ever chosen me for adoption, that I had constructed entire fantasies about parents who were searching for me, who had lost me by accident rather than by choice. One night, perhaps 6 weeks after our wedding, Dante sat on the edge of my bed instead of in the chair, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, smell that cedar and smoke scent that I had come to associate with safety rather than fear. He took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and told me that he saw me, that I was not invisible to him, that in fact, I had become the most visible thing in his world. He said that he had tried to maintain distance, had tried to keep our arrangement purely transactional, but that he had failed, that somewhere in the past weeks I had become important to him in a way that terrified him, because important things could be used against him, could be taken away, could become weaknesses that destroyed everything he had built. I told him that I understood fear, that I had lived with it every day since Sister Margaret had told me about the marriage arrangement, but that I had also learned that fear could be transformed into something else if you were brave enough to let it. He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup my face, his thumb tracing my lower lip with a gentleness that contradicted everything I had heard about him. He asked if he could kiss me, actually asked rather than simply taking, and the question itself was more intimate than any touch. I nodded, unable to form words, and he closed the distance between us slowly, giving me time to pull away, to refuse, to establish boundaries. His lips met mine softly, tentatively, a question more than a demand, and I felt something ignite inside me, a warmth that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. The kiss deepened gradually, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, all my nervousness dissolving in the face of this connection that felt inevitable, as though we had been moving toward this moment since the day we met in that cold church. He pulled back after several heartbeats, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against mine, and he told me that he wanted me, that he had wanted me since that night I had stitched his wound, but that he would not take what was not freely given, that despite everything that had brought us together, despite the transaction that had bound us, this part had to be my choice. I looked into those storm cloud eyes and saw the vulnerability there, the hope mixed with fear, the desperate desire for connection warring with the instinct to protect himself. I told him that I chose him, that whatever had started as obligation had transformed into something real, that I wanted to know what it felt like to be touched with care, to be wanted for myself, and not as a debt settlement or a burden. He kissed me again, deeper this time with more certainty, and his hands began to explore, tracing the curves of my body through the thin nightgown, igniting sensations I had never experienced. He was gentle, so much gentler than I had expected, taking his time, asking silent questions with every touch, waiting for my responses before proceeding. When he finally removed my nightgown, his eyes roamed over my body with an appreciation that made me feel beautiful for the first time in my life, not as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality. He told me I was perfect, that every part of me was exactly right, and I believed him because his voice held none of the calculated smoothness of someone telling a lie, but rather the raw honesty of someone speaking a truth they had not planned to share. What followed was a revelation, a discovery of connection that went far beyond the physical act itself. He moved with patience and care, always watching my face for signs of discomfort or hesitation, adjusting his movements to match my inexperience, murmuring reassurances and praise. There was pain, brief and sharp, and he stilled immediately, giving me time to adjust, his lips pressing kisses to my forehead, my cheeks, my lips, until the discomfort faded into something else entirely, building pleasure that grew with each movement, each touch, each whispered word. He brought me to heights I had not known existed, sensations that overwhelmed my senses and left me gasping his name, clinging to him as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and bright. When he finally let himself go, his body shuddering above me, his face buried in my neck, I felt the walls he had maintained between us finally, completely collapse. We lay tangled together afterward, our breathing gradually slowing, our heartbeats synchronizing, and I felt a peace I had never known, a sense of belonging that had eluded me my entire life. He held me close, his arms wrapped around me protectively, and told me that I had changed him, that I had somehow managed to reach parts of himself he had thought long dead, that he did not know what the future held, but that he wanted to face it with me by his side. I told him that I felt the same, that what had started as fear and obligation had transformed into something I hesitantly named love, though the word felt inadequate to describe the depth and complexity of what I felt. He kissed my hair and told me that love was exactly the right word, that he had loved me for weeks but had been too afraid to admit it, too worried that speaking it aloud would make it real and therefore vulnerable. The following months were a period of discovery and growth for both of us. Dante began to include me in aspects of his life he had previously kept separate, explaining his business in terms that did not glorify the darkness, but did not hide it either. He told me that he was trying to change, to move his operations away from the most violent and destructive elements, to build something that could eventually be legitimate. It was slow progress, complicated by enemies and obligations and the reality that changing course in his world was not a simple decision, but a dangerous process that required careful navigation. But he was trying, and I saw the effort it took, the toll it exacted, the constant balancing act between who he had been and who he wanted to become. I supported him in every way I could, becoming not just his wife but his partner, his confidant, the person he trusted with his doubts and fears. I helped Mrs. Reeves manage the household, gradually transforming the cold mansion into something that felt more like a home. I planted gardens, filled rooms with flowers, opened curtains to let in light, made changes that seemed small, but that shifted the atmosphere from one of isolation to one of possibility. I also continued my education, using the extensive library to learn about business and finance, studying the structures that supported and surrounded Dante's empire, making myself useful in ways that went beyond emotional support. He noticed, appreciated, began asking my opinion on decisions, weighing my input alongside that of his advisors, treating me as an equal rather than a possession. Our relationship deepened with each passing day, the physical intimacy we shared growing more intense and connected as we learned each other's bodies and desires. But it was the emotional intimacy that truly bound us, the late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the quiet moments of simply being together without need for words or actions, just presence and acceptance. Then came the night that shattered our growing peace. Dante had been meeting with representatives from a rival organization, attempting to negotiate terms for a truce that would allow him to begin his transition away from the most violent aspects of his business. I had stayed home, as was typical for such meetings, spending the evening reading in the library. It was past midnight when I heard the cars approach, the sounds of shouting and gunfire that made my blood run cold. I moved to the window and saw chaos unfolding on the grounds, men running, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness, and in the center of it all, Dante fighting his way toward the house. I knew with terrible certainty that this was an ambush, that the negotiations had been a trap, that someone wanted him dead and had used the promise of peace to lure him into vulnerability. Without thinking, without considering my own safety, I ran downstairs and grabbed one of the guns I knew Dante kept in his study. I had never fired a weapon in my life, had never even held one, but in that moment, my only thought was protecting him, keeping him safe, refusing to let this world of violence take away the person I loved. I made it to the front entrance just as Dante burst through, blood on his face, his suit torn, his eyes wild with adrenaline and fury. Behind him, 3 men pursued, weapons raised, and I did something I would never have imagined myself capable of. I raised the gun, aimed at the chandelier above the attackers, and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked me backward, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but my aim was true. The massive crystal fixture came crashing down, trapping the pursuers beneath its weight, buying precious seconds. Dante turned to me, shock and fear and something like pride warring in his expression. And then he was pulling me away from the entrance, yelling for his men, securing the house against the attack. The next hours were a blur of violence and strategy, phone calls and mobilization, the full weight of Dante's organization brought to bear against the traitors who had thought they could eliminate him. By dawn, it was over. The attackers were either dead or captured, the threat neutralized. The balance of power in the city shifted once again, but the cost was visible in Dante's face, in the exhaustion and pain and anger that lined his features. He found me in the library where I had retreated after the immediate danger passed, still holding the gun I had taken, my hands shaking now that the adrenaline had faded. He took the weapon from me gently and set it aside, then pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. He told me I was insane, reckless, that I could have been killed, that I should have stayed hidden, and I heard the fear beneath the anger, the terror of losing me that he could not quite hide. I told him that I loved him, that I would not stand by and watch him die, that my life had only truly begun when he entered it, and I was not about to let it end so soon. He kissed me with desperate intensity, as though trying to prove to himself that I was real and alive and safe, and I kissed him back with equal fervor, needing the connection, the reassurance, the reminder that we had survived. Later, as we sat together watching the sun rise through the library windows, Dante told me that he was done, that this attack had clarified everything, that he would no longer try to gradually transition, but would instead make a clean break, walking away from the empire he had built, liquidating assets, paying off debts, burning bridges that needed burning. I asked him if he was certain, if he could truly walk away from the power and control that had defined his adult life, and he looked at me with absolute conviction. He said that he had spent years building an empire because he thought power would protect him, would fill the emptiness inside him, would prove his worth. But that he had been wrong, that real power was not control over others but connection with them, that real worth was not measured in fear or money but in love and loyalty freely given. He told me that he wanted to start over, to leave this city and its memories, to build a life that was ours alone, defined by our choices rather than our pasts. He asked me if I would go with him, if I would leave behind the only home I had known as an adult, if I would trust him enough to step into uncertainty together. I did not hesitate in my answer. I told him that home was not a place but a person, that wherever he went I would follow, that we would build something new together, something clean and good and entirely our own. The months that followed were intense and complicated as Dante dismantled his empire piece by piece, navigating the dangerous politics of exit, ensuring that his departure would not leave a power vacuum that would lead to war. He used his knowledge and connections to broker deals that would maintain stability while freeing him from obligation, and I stood beside him through every negotiation, every difficult decision, every moment of doubt. There were threats, attempts at retaliation, efforts by others to trap him in the life he was trying to leave. But Dante had spent years building relationships alongside his empire, and many of those relationships proved to be genuine in the end. People who owed him favors repaid them by facilitating his exit, by covering his retreat, by ensuring that his departure was seen as voluntary rather than weakness. Finally, almost a year after that terrible night of the ambush, we left. We drove away from the mansion in the early morning, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I did not look back. We traveled for months, moving from city to city, staying nowhere long enough to establish patterns, enjoying the freedom of anonymity. Dante had set aside enough money that we would never need to worry about survival, and we used that freedom to explore, to discover who we were when stripped of the roles we had played for so long. We found a small coastal town eventually, a place where nobody knew our names or our history, where we could simply be two people in love building a life together. Dante bought a house, nothing grand or impressive, just a comfortable home with a view of the ocean, and we spent our days working in the garden, cooking meals together, taking long walks on the beach. He smiled more, laughed easily, lost the constant tension that had marked his features during his years as a cartel boss. I bloomed in the sunshine and peace, my body filling out, my confidence growing, my sense of self no longer tied to being unwanted or invisible, but instead rooted in being chosen, being loved, being seen. We married again, a small ceremony on the beach with only the local priest and 2 witnesses, exchanging vows that we had written ourselves, promises that reflected the journey we had taken together rather than the transaction that had brought us together. This time, when Dante slipped a ring on my finger, it was not heavy and cold but warm and filled with meaning. This time, when the priest pronounced us husband and wife, we kissed without hesitation, without walls, without anything between us but love and hope in the future we were creating together. 2 years after we left his old life behind, I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled me with joy and terror in equal measure, bringing up old fears about motherhood, about being enough, about creating family when I had never truly had one myself. But Dante met my fears with unwavering support and excitement, telling me that we would figure it out together, that we would create the family neither of us had growing up, that our child would be raised with love and security and the knowledge that they were wanted. Our daughter was born on a sunny morning in May, with dark hair like her father and my eyes, a perfect combination of both of us. Dante held her with such tenderness, such awe, that I fell in love with him all over again, seeing him transformed by fatherhood, watching him cradle this tiny life we had created together. He named her Catherine, after the saint who had watched over my childhood, and I cried at the gesture, at the way he honored my past while building our future. We raised her in that coastal town, surrounded by community and beauty, teaching her kindness and strength, honesty and courage. Dante proved to be an incredible father, patient and engaged, finding joy in every milestone, every accomplishment, every moment of her growing up. He coached her soccer team, helped with homework, told her stories at bedtime that made her laugh with delight. I watched him with our daughter and knew that he had broken every cycle of violence and emotional distance that had marked his own childhood, that he had transformed himself completely, that the man he had become was the man he had always wanted to be but had never had the safety or support to become. Our life was not perfect. We had disagreements and challenges, moments of stress and worry, but we faced everything together, never falling back into old patterns of isolation or control. We built a marriage based on partnership and respect, communication and compromise, and it grew stronger with each passing year. We had 2 more children eventually, a son and another daughter, and our house was filled with noise and laughter, the chaos of family life that I had dreamed about during all those lonely years at the orphanage. Dante continued to change, becoming involved in the community, using his business knowledge to help local organizations, mentoring young people who needed guidance, transforming the skills he had developed in darkness into tools for light. He never spoke about his past to anyone but me, keeping those years locked away as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when power became more important than people. But he also did not run from his history, acknowledging the harm he had caused, making amends where possible, living each day with the intention of being better than he had been the day before. I often thought about that girl who had stood in the cold church 20 years ago, terrified and alone, being married to a stranger for a debt she had not incurred. I thought about how that moment had seemed like an ending, the final confirmation that I had no value, no control, no future worth living. But it had not been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, the first step on a journey that would take me from invisibility to visibility, from fear to love, from obligation to choice. Dante and I had both been shaped by trauma and circumstance. Both had built walls to survive. Both had forgotten what connection felt like until we found each other. Our love had not been instant or easy, had not followed the patterns of romantic stories where attraction and affection bloom immediately. Instead, it had been hard-won, earned through vulnerability and risk, built on a foundation of seeing each other clearly, accepting the darkness alongside the light, choosing each other again and again through every challenge and change. On our 20th wedding anniversary, we returned to that coastal town church where we had married for the second time. Our children were grown by then, Catherine in medical school, our son studying environmental science, our youngest daughter pursuing art. They had flown in for the celebration, along with friends and neighbors, people who knew us only as the kind couple who ran the community center, who helped anyone in need, who had built a life of quiet service and deep love. Dante took my hand as we stood together at the front of the church, the same spot where we had exchanged our second set of vows, and he told everyone gathered about our story. He spoke honestly about his past, about the violence and darkness that had defined his early life, about the transaction that had brought us together, about the debt and obligation that had seemed like a curse but had become a blessing. He talked about the night I had stitched his wound, about the moment he had realized that I saw him as a person rather than a role, about the gradual falling in love that had transformed everything. He spoke about the decision to leave his empire, about the fear and uncertainty of starting over, about the joy of building a life based on choice rather than circumstance. And then he turned to me, his eyes still that same storm cloud gray but now filled with warmth and light, and he thanked me. He thanked me for seeing him, for choosing him, for standing beside him through every transition and challenge, for giving him a family and a home and a reason to become better than he had been. He said that I had saved him in every way a person could be saved, that I was his redemption and his hope, his present and his future, his everything. I held his face in my hands, this man who had been a stranger and had become my world, and I told him that he had saved me too, that he had given me value and purpose, love and family, a life beyond anything I had imagined possible. I said that our story was proof that people could change, that love could transform, that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest futures if you were brave enough to choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over walls, growth over stagnation. We kissed then, to the applause and tears of everyone gathered, and I felt the circle complete, the journey from that cold church to this warm one, from fear to love, from strangers bound by debt to partners bound by choice. Our story was not a fairy tale. It was messier and more complex than that, filled with real struggles and real growth. But it was ours, and it was beautiful precisely because of its imperfection. We had both been broken in different ways. Both had carried trauma and loneliness. Both had wondered if we would ever truly be seen and accepted. And then we had found each other. Two damaged people who had learned to heal together, who had discovered that sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes if you are willing to take the risk, to be vulnerable, to believe that change is possible. As we left the church that day, surrounded by our children and friends, walking into the sunshine of a perfect afternoon, I thought about all the other people out there who felt trapped, who felt invisible, who had been told they were nothing more than transactions or obligations or problems to be solved. I wanted them to know that circumstances do not define destiny, that where you start does not determine where you finish, that love and transformation are always possible if you are brave enough to choose them. Dante squeezed my hand as we walked, and I looked up at him. This man who had been my husband for 20 years, who had gone from cruel cartel boss to devoted father and partner, who had proven every day that people are not fixed, but fluid, not static, but capable of profound change. And I smiled, filled with gratitude for this life we had built together, for every struggle that had strengthened us, for every choice that had brought us closer, for every moment of connection that had transformed obligation into love. So now I turn to you, dear listener, and I ask you to reflect on this story, on the journey of two broken people who found wholeness together, who transformed trauma into triumph, who proved that love can bloom even in the darkest soil. How would you rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10? Does it resonate with you? Does it give you hope? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Let me know if stories like this touch your heart and make you believe in the possibility of change and redemption. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories about love, family, transformation, and the incredible capacity of the human heart to heal and grow. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. Remember that no matter where you start, no matter what circumstances have shaped your life so far, you have the power to choose differently, to write a new chapter, to become someone new. Your story is not over, and the best parts may still be ahead if you are brave enough to take that first step toward change.